Hello and welcome to the first video in this three-part series designed to show you how to create your first Windows Store app. This series is based on the Create Your First Windows Store App step-by-step tutorials found at dev.windows.com and is divided into three parts. This video is part 1. We'll be creating a simple Hello World Windows Store app using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We'll show how to create a new project, we'll build some basic HTML for a Hello World page, and show how to handle a button click event. Next, we'll show how to switch between the built-in light and dark themes and how to create your own custom CSS styles. And finally, we'll show how to use the Windows library for JavaScript rating control. In part 2, Manage App Lifecycle and State, we'll discuss the app lifecycle and we'll extend the Hello World app by storing app data in Windows roaming settings and saving session state data using the Win.js application session state object. In part 3, Page Control Objects and Navigation, we'll migrate our app to use the Navigation app template and page control objects, and we'll add an app bar to navigate between pages using the Win.js navigation service. I want to emphasize that the best way to learn is by doing. Don't just watch me write code. We designed this series so you can open up Visual Studio and follow along step by step. Before you start, to complete this tutorial, you need to have Windows 8 installed. A free 90-day evaluation of Windows 8 is available for download. You will also need to install a version of Microsoft Visual Studio 2012. You can download a free version of Microsoft Visual Studio Express 2012 for Windows 8 available from www.microsoft.com/express. You will also need a developer license. You can obtain a developer license by selecting a File New Project and building a Windows Store app, or directly from the Store menu, select Acquire Developer License. Acquire Developer License. Step 1. Create a new project in Visual Studio. The first thing we're going to do is launch Visual Studio Express 2012 for Windows 8 just by typing the letter VS on the search pane, and we see VS Express for Windows 8, and go ahead and click that. Now once this is open, select File, New Project, and I'll just zoom in here so you can see it. Go ahead and select that, and that'll show us the New Project dialog. From here, make sure that the JavaScript Windows Store templates are selected, and select the blank app template. With that selected, let's actually name our project Hello World. And you can choose whatever location you want to save it to. And I'm going to uncheck Create a Directory for the solution. And with all that set, let's click OK to start creating our project. With our project created, select Solution Explorer, and you'll see that we built a minimal project that includes a number of different things. And let's just quickly walk through some of the files within our solution. If you expand References, you'll see that References includes a Windows library for JavaScript 1.0 and includes CSS files for a dark and light UI, as well as some built-in JavaScript files. It includes a CSS folder that includes default.css that's used in the default.html page for the visual design of that page. It also includes a series of images, and these images are represented in different ways. For example, the logo and small logo images are displayed in your start screen, while the store logo PNG is used to represent your app in the Windows Store. And finally, splash screen PNG, which is used to show your app when it starts. It also includes a JS folder for all of your JavaScript files. By default, this includes default.js, a default.html page, which is a basic HTML page that we'll be editing in just a second. And finally, there's package.appxmanifest. This is a manifest file that describes your app, including its name, the description used in the app, title, start page, splash screen, and all the images we saw before, and lists all of the files that your app contains. These files are essential to all Windows Store apps using JavaScript, and any project that you create in Visual Studio contains them. Step 2. Launch the app. At this point, we've created a very simple app, and if you want to see what it looks like, you can either press F5 on your keyboard to build, deploy, and start your app, or you can click right here, this button, to run it on your local machine. There's our splash screen, and there's the page loaded. That's that default.html page that just contains the text, content goes here. There's no button or command to close the app, so to close the app, what we're going to do is slide from the top edge with my mouse, and you see the cursor turns into a hand, and just slide it down towards the bottom edge of the screen, or press Alt F4. Now that we're in the start screen, notice that deploying the app adds its tiles to the last group on the start screen. To run the app again, tap or click its tile on the start screen, and of course we can press F5 in Visual Studio as well. It doesn't do much yet, but congratulations, you've built your first Windows Store app. Step 3. Modify your start page. Let's switch back to Visual Studio, click Alt-Tab, and in Solution Explorer, select default.html and go ahead and double-click it to open it. To make it easier to see this code, I'm just going to increase our font size here to 140%, and you can always use the mouse wheel with click mouse wheel to increase the size. And let's close just by hitting the close here, our output window, to give us as much space as possible. Within our HTML tag, we have some head tags that include links to JavaScript files, CSS files, and so on, including ones specifically to our project. What we're going to do, though, is add some HTML tags in between the body tags. And here's the default.html page that Visual Studio created for us. Like any normal HTML page, there's an HTML tag surrounding everything, a head tag that includes links to CSS files as well as JavaScript files, and then links to our specific project, default.css and default.js, that we'll be changing later. For now, what we're going to be doing is adding just regular HTML tags into our body tag to be able to have a user input some text and have a button click event. So let's add a first level heading for our title, and we'll say hello world. Underneath that, we'll use a paragraph tag and just say, what's your name? And from here, we can just add regular HTML input, and I'll say input, and let's just call this ID name input. And the type will be text. And this is where users can actually input some text. And we'll add a button, and let's just call that hello button. And we'll say hello. All right, so there's our button control. And let's add a div here, and this is going to be the output of our click event, greeting output. And we'll use this a little later, so in the button click event, we can actually display it by setting the inner text of this greeting output div. So what we've done is replace the body with some large text hello world with the paragraph tag that includes just what's your name, and right next to each other will be an input text box as well as a button click event labeled hello, and there'll be nothing displayed here, but we'll be adding that in later steps. And go ahead and click F5 or run here so we can see what it looks like. So there's our page, we see our big text, and notice if we just type anything here, nothing actually happens. Hello, nothing actually happens. In our next step, we'll go ahead and add the event handler. Now let's switch back to Visual Studio and click the Stop button. Next is step 4, create an event handler. Now that we've written our HTML code, what we want to do is go back to your Solution Explorer, expand JS, and double-click on the default.js file to open it. Like before, I'm going to just expand this to 140% so you can easily follow along. To see as much of this code as possible, I'm going to be using a Visual Studio command called full screen, and that's Shift-Alt-Enter, or under the Quick Launch menu up here, you can just start typing in, if you don't know Visual Studio commands, full screen, and you'll see our full screen is Shift-Alt-Enter, and I'll go ahead and click that. And notice this just gives us as much space as possible to see all the code within default.js. And the first thing we want to do here is just right-click, and I'm just going to use outlining collapse to definitions. Outlining collapse to definitions. And what this does is just collapses everything so that we can easily see all of the different functions within our file. Now the first thing to notice is all of our code is actually wrapped up in an anonymous function that is self-executing, and we know that because of the parens here. And the reason for this is because it makes it easier to avoid naming conflicts or situations where you accidentally modify a value that you didn't intend to. As you may remember, JavaScript variables can be either local or global. We want to make sure local variables, meaning variables declared in functions, don't interfere with the global namespace. So that's why all of the variables within here and all of the functions are declared within this function to make them local instead of global. The next line of code turns on strict mode for JavaScript. And strict mode provides additional error checking for your code. For example, it prevents you from using implicitly declared variables or assigning a value to a read-only property. As you can see, default.js also handles the onActivated and onCheckpoint events. We go into more detail about these events later. For now, just know that the activated event fires when your app starts. Now what we're going to do is after app.start is define our own function. And what we're going to do is define our own JavaScript function right before app.start. We're going to define a function named button click handler. And let's write the function definition of if I start typing fun, I'll see if I click code snippet for function, I hit tab twice. And now this is just a fill in the blank for button click handler. I'll click enter. And let's also make sure that button click handler has a parameter named event info. With Windows 8, you don't need to worry about the differences between touch, mouse, and other forms of pointer input. You can just use events that you know, like the click event, and they work for all forms of input. And the first thing we're going to do is we'll create a variable named username, and that'll retrieve what the user actually typed into that text box. So we'll use document.getElementById, and if you remember, our text box was named nameInput, and we want the value. So now that we know what the user has typed into that text box, the next thing we're going to do is build a greeting. Now let's build our greeting. We'll call this var greeting string equals hello. And we'll use our variable for username. We're just concatenating strings here to display back whatever the user typed into the text box, wrapped in hello with an exclamation mark. Now that we've built the message we want to display it, we're going to use document.getElementById, and we're going to find the greeting output div that we built earlier, and we'll set the inner text property equal to that string. So when this function is called, we'll get whatever the user typed into the text box, put it to the username, we'll build a custom greeting string that is hello, whatever the user typed in, an exclamation mark, and then we'll display it back to the user by setting the inner text property of the greeting output div. Now that we've created the button click event handler, we have to register this function a call when the button's actually clicked. Step 5, register the event handler when our app launches. To register this button click handler, you may be tempted to go back to your default.html file and use the onClick event to call the button event handler. Now, one reason you can't do that is because it doesn't have a reference to the name. And that's because, as we explained earlier, this is all wrapped within an anonymous function. So there's no way for the event handler to be able to call button click handler. To do this, there's two ways. We can either define this in the global namespace by writing some code to define button click handler in our global namespace, or the preferred way is to add an event listener on app.onActivated, and that's what we're going to show next. So let's expand the onActivated function. The code checks to see what type of activation occurred. In this example, it's checking for activation kind of launch, and the launch activation is used when an app is launched whenever it is not running and then a user activates it. Next, the code checks to see how the app was shut down the last time it ran. If the app's been newly launched, this code will execute. Otherwise, it's been reactivated from suspension, and this else will launch. And we'll cover this in much more detail in the Manage App Lifecycle and State tutorial. Whether it's been terminated or not, we're going to make a call to setPromise WinJS UI.processAll. This function scans your default.html file for Windows library for JavaScript controls and initializes them. So far, we haven't added any of these controls, but in step 7, we'll be adding a rating control that requires this WinJS UI.processAll to initialize the control. Now, the call to processAll is enclosed in a setPromise method. This will make sure that the splash screen isn't taken down until the apps page is ready. Now, a good place to register our event handlers for non-Windows library for JavaScript controls is just after the call to WinJS UI.processAll. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to register our button click event. So let's add a comment here saying what we're going to do. We're going to retrieve the button and register our event handler. To do that, we'll get a reference to our button named hello button equals, and we'll say document.getElementById. And if you remember, we called our button hello button. Now that we have our button, we can say hello button and use add event listener. And this takes a couple different parameters. The first type is a click event. And now is where we point to our function, and that function is the button click handler. Next, we're going to set the useCaptureBoolean. We're going to set the useCaptureBoolean to false. And what that's going to do is have it instead fire to our target element and then its parent. If we want to fire to the parent first, we'd set it to true. Let's switch out of full screen mode and go ahead and click F5 or click the button to run our app. Now that our app is loaded, let's just type in, say, somebody special. We'll click say hello. Our event listener fires, displays our message, somebody special, with exclamation mark on the end. Now let's Alt-Tab, back to Visual Studio, and go ahead and click Stop. Step 6, Style or Start Page. Let's switch back to default.html and notice that we have a style sheet UI.dark CSS declared in WinJS reference. This is a Windows library for JavaScript style sheet, and it includes a set of styles that automatically give our app the Windows 8 look and feel. And by using this style sheet, you get a number of benefits, including being able to work great with touch displays, automatic support for high contrast modes, automatic support for other languages, and automatic support for other reading orders, like right to left. Now, as you may remember, these style sheets were declared in Windows Library for JavaScript. Under our CSS, we have both a UI dark and a UI light. What we're going to do is change our file to point to the UI light CSS so we can see the visual difference just by changing the CSS. To do that, make sure you're in default.html, and we'll just change the name of this to UI light. With that one simple change, go ahead and click Run, and let's see what our application looks like now. As you can see, this did a number of changes. Obviously, our background color is now white, our fonts are darker, and even our button color changed. Now, which style sheet should you use? This really depends on what you want. For apps that mostly display images or video, we recommend using the dark style sheet, and for apps that contain a lot of text, we recommend using the light style sheet. Now, if you want to customize the look and feel of your app, you don't have to throw out the Windows library for JavaScript styles and start over from scratch. It's easy to make incremental changes by overriding the styles you want to change. So let's switch back to Visual Studio. Let's stop our app. And you can override any style in the default style sheet by creating your own style sheet and including it after the Windows library for JavaScript style sheet. Now, the blank app template already does this for you by defining a default.css style sheet. And we'll be building our custom style sheets in just a second. Before that, we actually need to define some classes within our HTML body. Let's define a class for our header, named header class. And next what we want to do is define a div tag and wrap everything within it. So I'm just going to take this end tag and put it at the very end of our file, even after greeting output. To make this a little easier to read, go ahead and select this div, right click and select Format Selection, and that'll just do some nice indenting to make it really clear what we're defining. Now within this div, let's go ahead and call this a class equal main content. Next, let's define the styles for those classes, and we'll do that in Solution Explorer. Go ahead and under CSS, double-click on default.css to open that file. And we'll select 140% to just zoom in here and get a better view. And notice the generated file contains a few stubs for defining styles for different views that are used within a Windows Store app. We'll ignore these stubs for now, but we'll play with them in a later tutorial. Now after the body style, let's define our classes, and the first one we'll define is our header class. And in these styles, we're going to be defining some of the app page default margins. First thing we'll do is set the top margin, and we'll set that with margin top. We're going to set that to 45 pixels from the top for the header, as well as a left margin, and that left margin will be 120 pixels from the left. Now for main content, what I'll do is just copy paste this within here, and let's make sure this is nicely formatted. For main content, we'll have a top margin of 31 pixels. We'll keep a left margin of 120, and then a bottom margin as well of 50 pixels. Next, let's define a style for our greeting output. So we'll just call the style greeting output. And within here, we're going to define a height of 20 pixels. We'll also set the bottom margin, do that with margin bottom, and we'll set that to 40 pixels. And now that we've set these properties, let's go ahead and click F5 or run it again. And we see the different spacing. Instead of our text being on top of each other, we see all the different values, and let's go ahead and just add somebody special to run our app again, say hello. There we see hello, somebody special. Now let's switch back to Visual Studio and go ahead and click Stop. Step 7. Add a Windows library for JavaScript control. So far in this tutorial, we've been using standard HTML controls, but you can also use Windows library for JavaScript controls. And these are pre-built controls like a date picker, a flip view, a list view, and a rating control that you can add to your app. So what we're going to do is just click on our default.html file and just double click it to open it, and we're going to add a rating control to our page. So let's full screen this, and underneath our greeting output div, we're going to add a label control. We'll set the 4, and we'll call this rating control div. And within here, let's just call this rate this greeting. Now that we have a label to actually build our rating control, it's a little different than what you'd normally expect. Instead of adding a rating element to our page, the way we build these JavaScript controls is by adding a div tag and setting the data when control property to the specific name of the control. So let's do that. Let's call it div id equals, and we'll call this rating control div just so we can reference it later. And now set the data when control property equal to, and notice we do get IntelliSense in here, winjs.ui.rating control. I'll exit out full screen, and let's go ahead and just run this again. And there's our rating control, as well as our label. We can set these values, and now let's add some code to this. Go back to Visual Studio and click Stop. Step 8. Register an event handler for a Windows library for JavaScript control. Registering an event handler for a Windows library for JavaScript control is a little different than registering an event handler for a standard HTML control. Now the first thing we're actually going to do is add a new div, and this div is going to display the output from the rating control. So we'll just call it rating output. Let's switch to our default JS, and what we're going to do is at the bottom of our file, but before app start, we're going to add a new function, and this function is going to be called rating changed. So let's declare the function rating changed, and within here let's make sure to actually pass in event info as a parameter. Now the event info parameter contains a detail.tentative rating property that provides the new user rating. So what we'll do is get a reference to our div. Let's do that first. Var rating output equals, and we'll use the document get element by ID. And this is the div that we just added, named rating output. Now that we have that, we want to set the inner text of it, rating output dot inner text equal to event info dot detail dot tentative rating. Now that we've declared this function, we actually need to call it when the rating changes, and what we'll do is go back up to our onActivated event, and we'll show some of the unique things we need to do for Windows library for JavaScript controls. Now if rating were a standard HTML control, we could add our event handler directly after the call to process all, just like we did with our button event handler. But it's a little more complicated for a Windows library for JavaScript control like our rating control. And since the process all method is asynchronous, any code that follows it might run before process all actually completes. So what we're going to do is use a promise object to receive notification when the process all completes. Now a promise is a promise that something will happen in the future, and when that thing happens, the promise is said to have completed. And promise objects have a then method. So if we see here directly on our code, and in between these two parentheses, we're going to add a dot then. And what this does is it's going to say any code within here, and we'll build a quick function called completed, will execute after the call to process all is completed. There's our method declaration. Let's build two tags, and we want to make sure to push all of our code within here. So let's push our existing code directly within this completed method. Now I'm going to add another parentheses here. I want to make sure that we have a parentheses for the setPromise method, so all of this is within setPromise. If we select this character, then we see this parentheses is all the code that will happen within the then. Then finally the bracket is the declaration for the function completed. And what we'll do is add some code to get a reference to our rating control, and then use add event listener to call our function. First, what I'm going to do is retrieve the div that hosts the rating control. Let's build a variable for this, and we'll call it retrieve control div. And we'll find it by using document.getElementById. And what we're looking for is the name of the div is rating control div. Now that we have that, what we're going to do next is retrieve the actual rating control. And let's just call it rating control equals rating control div. That's the control we just found. And we'll say .win control. And that's a reference to the actual rating control. Once we have that, we can actually register our event handler. And now let's set rating control .add event listener. And the event we're looking for is the change event. The function we're going to use is rating change, and for our use capture, we'll just set that to false. So let's review what we've done. We added the process all and added the then method, which takes a function. And what's going to happen is the process all is going to run, and once it's complete, it's going to call our completed function. Now within our completed function, we get a reference to the div, rating control div, that is hosting the rating control. We retrieve the actual rating using the win control. And within the win control, what we can do is add an event listener to the change event, passing in our function. And so there's our code. Let me just eliminate some of these lines. And we'll go ahead and just click run. And let's add some text here, someone special for our name. We'll click say hello. We'll select our greeting of 4. And notice our text box now fired that change event for the rating control and set the div to that tentative rating. Congratulations, you've completed part 1, create a Hello World app. In part 2, manage app lifecycle and state, we'll discuss the app lifecycle and show how to store app data in Windows roaming settings and session state data using the Win.js application session state object. Hello and welcome to the second video in this 3-part series designed to show you how to create your first Windows Store app. In this video, you'll learn how the app lifecycle works and how to save and restore app data and session state in a Windows Store app. Before we get started, let's review the lifecycle of a Windows Store app. As you can see in this slide, there are 3 possible states for an app: running, suspended, and not running. Let's start with the suspended state. An app can be suspended when the user switches away from it or when Windows enters a low power state. While your app is suspended, it continues to reside in memory so that users can quickly and reliably switch between suspended apps, resuming them. When your app is suspended and then resumed, you don't have to write any extra code to make it look as though it had been running the entire time. Your app can also be terminated. When the user closes an app by pressing Alt F4 or using the close gesture, the app is suspended for 10 seconds and then terminated. Windows can also terminate a suspended app at any time to free up memory for other apps or to save power. When the user closes an app by pressing Alt F4 or using the close gesture, the app is suspended for 10 seconds and then terminated. Windows can also terminate a suspended app at any time to free up memory for other apps or to save power. When your app is terminated, it stops running and is unloaded from memory. The important part here is that Windows notifies your app when it suspends it, but doesn't provide additional notification when it terminates the app. That means your app must handle the suspended event and use that event to save its state and release any exclusive resources. App data is persistent across sessions and must always be accessible to the user. To store app data, we'll use the roaming settings property of the application data container. The roaming settings app data container makes it easy to store data in a way that is accessible to the user across multiple machines like a home and work PC. The data is automatically uploaded to the cloud in the background for you. Session data, on the other hand, is temporary data that is relevant to the user's current session in your app. You restore this data only if Windows suspends and terminates the app. To save session data for our app, we'll store it in the Win.js application session state object. Now that you have a better understanding of the app lifecycle, let's add some code to make sure we save and restore data in our Hello World app. Before we get started, why don't we click Run on our current Hello World application. And we'll just type a quick greeting here. We'll just say somebody special, say hello. And one of the things we want to do is to be able to handle these suspension events. So what we want to do is to be able to save the text value in this text, save our output greeting, save the selected rating control value, as well as the text label for that rating control. Now that we know what we want to do, let's go ahead and switch back to Visual Studio and get started. Step 1. Save app data. App data persists across sessions and must always be accessible to the user. In our app, let's just go to default.html and go ahead and double click it to open it, and we'll just set this to 140%. In our app, the value of the name input text box is what we want to save as app data, a setting that should appear in the app whenever the user runs it. Because our app only has 5 seconds to run code in the suspending event handler, you need to ensure that your app data is saved to persistent storage by the time your app is suspended or terminated. The best way to do this is to save app data incrementally when it changes. To do that, under the JS folder in Solution Explorer, you see the default.js file. Go ahead and double click that to open it. And I'll just zoom in here to 140%. And let's full screen our page. And let's scroll down to the bottom and add a new function. Now let's build a function. This function will be called name input change, and we'll pass in an event info. And the first thing we're going to do is get a reference to a variable, and we'll do that to who fired me, and that's the event info.src, or the source element, src element. And the source element property retrieves the element that fired the actual event. To save our data, we're going to use the Roman settings property of the windows.storage.applicationData object. Roaming settings returns an application data container, and we can use this to store user data that persists across sessions. Let's add a quick comment. Let's say we're going to store the user's name for multiple sessions. Now let's get a reference to our application data. So we'll say var app data equals windows.storage.applicationData.current. Now that we have a reference to our app data object, we'll go to var roaming settings, because we want to get a reference to our roaming settings, and we'll do that using app data dot, and you'll see that we have a roaming settings property here. And roaming settings is now our application data container, and we can set values using roaming settings dot values, and now we can set, for example, a key here, and I'll just say user name. And the value we want to set there is name input dot value. So let's just quickly review what we've done. When the name input change method fires, we're going to find out what control actually fired that using the source element. We'll get a reference to the current application data object. Next, we'll get a reference to the app data container for roaming settings. And in the app data container, we'll set key value properties. So we'll call it username as the key, and then the actual value will be the name input value from the text box that fired this event. Now that we've built the name input changed event, we need to go back up to our function on the app.onActivated and register this event using add event listener. Let's add a quick comment here to retrieve the input element and register our event handler. Like we did above, let's go ahead and build a variable that references the name input text box. And we'll use, just like before, document get element by ID. And we're looking for the name input text box. And we'll say name input dot add event listener. And what we're going to be listening to and subscribing to is the change event. And the function I want to fire is called name input changed. So we get the name input text box and add an event handler for the change event that will fire this function. Now let's save the state of the rating control when it changes. All we need to do is update the event handler we created earlier, which is rating change, and I can right click and select go to definition to jump to that function. And just like we did before, I'll go ahead and click enter. I'm going to go to the name input change and copy and paste this code because it's exactly the same. Except instead of the username for the key, we're going to say greeting rating. And for the value, instead of name input value, what we want to do is use the event info detail tentative rating. Just like we did before to set the inner text, we're going to be doing this to save the current value, the tentative rating, to the key named greeting rating. At this point, we've completed step 1 and saved our app data, including our greeting rating and our username. In our next step, we're going to show you how to save session data, which is a little different. And then in step 3, we're going to show you how you can actually load this data now that we've saved it, so you can actually load and see that your data was persisted. But first, let's talk about session data. Step 2, save session data. Unlike app data, which is saving our data to roaming settings, session data is temporary data that is relevant to the user's current session in your app. A session ends when the user closes the app using the close gesture, or Alt F4, if they reboot their computer, or if they log off their computer. In our app, the inner text of the greeting output div is session data. We restore it only if Windows suspends and terminates the app. Because the personalized greeting needs to be saved only for the session, we store it in winjs.application.sessionState. Let's add a quick comment here that says we're going to save the session data. And to use the sessions data object, we add a property to it and set that property's value. Let's first just get a reference to this. We'll say winjs.application.sessionState.greetingOutput. And at this point, we're creating this property, and we'll call it greetingOutput. And now we need to set that value, and it'll be the greeting string. So what we've done is added our own property called greetingOutput and set the value to our greeting string for the sessionState object. Now that we've shown how to save our data, either in roaming settings or within session-state, we're going to add a little bit of code to load this data. Step 3, restore the app state. Let's scroll all the way up to our onActivated event. And as you'll see, what we're doing is checking what kind of activation it was, and the activation kind of launch is what we're looking for. And we also want to see whether our application was terminated or not. If this method runs, that means our application is newly launched. Otherwise, our application has been reactivated from suspension. Regardless of whether the app was terminated or not, it will always call process all and then call the completed function once process all is done. And our completed function, of course, is the one that sets all of our event handlers for the change click and other change events for the text box and so on. Now what we want to do is go back up here and add some code that happens when our application is reactivated from suspension. Let's add a quick comment here and say what we're going to do. We're going to retrieve our greeting output session state info, and that's if it exists. What we're going to do is read that value that we set earlier, and we'll set it to output value. And to read it, we'll just say winjs.application.sessionState, and the value we called for that property was called greeting output. Let's do a quick if statement to make sure that our output value actually exists. And now let's get a reference to that, and we'll call this greeting output. And we want a reference to that div, and we'll use document.getElementID like we've done before. And the div is called greeting output. Now that we have a reference to that div, we can set its inner text property equal to the output value that we got from our session state. So we'll just set that to output value. Let's do a quick recap of what we've done. If our application is being reactivated from suspension, then we go to our session state and try and read out the greeting output property. If the output value exists, set the inner text property of that div equal to that text value. Next, we're going to load the username and rating from the roaming settings app data container. Unlike the greeting output, which is a session state variable and will only be reactivated when our app is coming back from suspension, we want to add different code that will always add the username and rating from the roaming settings. Right now, our greeting output is only restored when the session state is being reactivated from suspension. For our username and rating settings, we want to always load them. So what we're going to do is, instead of having them within this if-else, we'll have them in our function completed and restore our data directly from here. So right under name input, add some spaces, and let's go ahead and just add some code. First of all, I have some quick comment here that says we're going to restore app data Let's get a reference to our roaming settings. And roaming settings equals windows.storage.application-data.current.roaming settings. And from here, let's restore the username first. Let's read in the username first, and I'll just call the variable username. And we'll use roaming settings dot values. And the value we're going to be reading here, we called it username. Let's do a quick check, make sure if username has actually been set. And if it has, we're going to say name input dot value equals that username. Now let's restore the rating. We'll just say restore the rating. And let's read that value. So we'll say var greeting rating equals, we'll go to our roaming settings, values, and this time we used greeting rating as the name of the value we were saving. And if we have a value for greeting rating, let's say greeting rating, we'll set the rating control and the actual user rating equal to the greeting rating. And we also had a rating output div, so let's set that value as well. So we'll call this rating output equals document get element by ID. We're going to be pulling the rating output value, and we'll just set the rating output dot inner text equal to the greeting rating. Okay, let's review what we've done so far. First, we got a reference to our roaming settings app data container under windows.storage.application-data.current. While previously we saved the value in username, now we're going to restore the value by calling roaming settings.values, setting this as the username, and assuming that somebody set a username, change the text box value equal to that username. And for our rating control, similarly, we load up whatever the value was saved to greeting rating, and assuming a value was saved, then what we're going to do is refer to the rating control that we built here, which is a reference to the rating control div and the actual win control for the rating control div. So this is the reference to the control itself. And back down here, we're going to set the user rating for that rating control to whatever the greeting rating is. And finally, since we also display the rating value in a div, we're going to set the rating output to that value by setting its inner text. Now that we're done writing code, what we want to do is run the debugger and actually show how our roaming settings for both the username and the greeting rating will be loaded. So let's switch out of here and click F5 to run our app. And let's write a greeting here, and we'll just say somebody special and click say hello, and we'll set the rating control to 4. Now remember, the text input value is saved to roaming settings, as is our rating control, but this, our greeting output, is saved to session state. So if we switch back to Visual Studio and click stop and click run, you'll notice that anything that was set to roaming settings, which is our text box and our rating control and our div, loaded it correctly, but our greeting output, which was session state, did not load. And that's because if we switch back to Visual Studio, when we stop debugging, what happens is it causes a normal shutdown of the application. What we want to do is simulate the suspending event. To do that, let's go back to our application and we'll just click hello, so we know we have this value and it'll be saved to session state, assuming we have a suspension and termination. So back here in Visual Studio, we can simulate this, and I'll just zoom in, and if we click on this little checkbox, we see the option to suspend and shut down. By selecting this, Visual Studio suspends and terminates your app so that our suspending event will fire and the session state management code is executed. So I'll go ahead and click this and zoom out. Our session state code is executed, and if we click run again, we'll see that our session state is now restored as well as our roaming settings. Congratulations, you've completed Part 2, Manage App Lifecycle and State. You learned how to save and restore app data and session state in a Windows Store app. In our next part, Part 3, Page Control Objects and Navigation, we'll migrate our app to use the Navigation App Template and Page Control Objects, and show how to navigate between pages using the Win.js Navigation Service. Hello and welcome to the third and final video in this three-part series designed to show you how to create your first Windows Store app. In this video, Page Control Objects and Navigation will migrate our app to use the Navigation App template and Page Control Objects, and we'll add an app bar to navigate between pages using the Win.js navigation service. Step 1. Create a new navigation app in Visual Studio. First, let's launch Microsoft Visual Studio Express 2012 for Windows 8. We can do that just from the Start page by typing the letter VS, and we filter it down and we see VS Express for Windows 8, and go ahead and click that to open it. From here, let's select File, New Project, which will open up the New Project dialog. On the left pane, make sure you have JavaScript Windows Store templates listed, and select the Navigation App, and under Name, what we're going to do is call this Hello World with Pages. And let's just set that project name, Hello World with Pages. Now with that selected, make sure that Create Directory for Solution is also unchecked, and save wherever you'd like, and go ahead and click OK. Now let's select the Solution Explorer and just take a second to walk through the files that Visual Studio has added to our project. Let's expand the Pages folder, and we see that we have a Home Page Control. These three files define a page control for the app's home page. A page control is made up of an HTML page, a JavaScript file, and a CSS file. A page control is a modular unit of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that can be navigated to like an HTML page or used as a custom control. You can use page control objects to split up a larger app into smaller, more manageable portions. And under our JS folder, we have a new file named navigator.js. This file provides the Page Control Navigator helper class that you can use to display page control objects and navigate between them. You don't need it to display page control, but it can make using and navigating between them easier. Now let's actually jump into our default.html page, so select it and double click it to open it, and I'll zoom out and just set our magnification here to 140%, and we'll full screen this. And for readability, I'll just add a line break here so we can see what's going on. Just like our last Hello World project, we have HTML tag, and in our head tag, we have references to style sheets and JavaScript files that are the Win.js references, as well as ones that are unique to this page, which is the default.js and navigator.js, as well as the default CSS style sheet. Now what's different here is in our body, we have a div that is a content host for the Page Control Navigator control. And the Page Control Navigator control loads our home.html page and acts as a container for any of those HTML page controls. Let's exit out of full screen mode and just run this by hitting F5. And even though it's not obvious, the app is actually showing both the default.html page, which is this outside Chrome, and inside that div, we're actually hosting the home.html code. This is similar to, say, using an iframe to display an HTML page inside another HTML page. Now let's Alt-Tab, back to Visual Studio, and click Stop. And next we're going to import a lot of the code from our Hello World app. Step 2. Copy your HTML and CSS content from your Hello World app. In our default.html page, we'll put any code that we want to be present no matter which page of the app we're displaying. And we'll use page controls, like the home.html page control, for content that makes up an individual screen in the app. Let's go to the Solution Explorer, select home.html, and just go ahead and double click it to open it. And I'll zoom in here real quick. And let's full screen this. And just like before, we have references to JavaScript and CSS files that are the Win.js references, as well as our own custom CSS and JavaScript files that are for home.css as well as default.css, and our own home.js that would include code that is specific to the home HTML page. In our body, notice that we have a header tag. The page header includes a back button for backwards navigation and a title area, which is that H1 title. The template contains code that automatically enables the back button when you can navigate backwards. The button won't be visible until we add a second page and navigate there, and that button allows you to navigate back to the last page. Underneath the header, we have a section, and that's where our main content's going to go. So what we're going to do is open the Hello World project from the previous step, and in Solution Explorer, go ahead and double-click default.html file to open it. We'll zoom in a bit here. And what we want to do is just take everything inside this body and copy and paste it directly into our home.html file. So I'm going to switch back to Hello World within Pages, and within here, I'm going to select Paste. The first thing we're going to do is start with our H1 tag. Select all the text, and hit Control X. Now since we already have an H1 for our header, let's just replace this text with the text that we want, which is our hello world text, and we can actually get rid of this H1 tag. And since home.html already has a main content section, we can actually delete this div and its matching div. And let's just select all this text within the section and select Format Selection. And we'll just quickly clean up our code. Now that we're done updating the body, we do need to update our CSS because we are using the light style. So just go up to the Win.js references, and where you see UI dark, we're going to replace with UI light.css. Now switch back to your original Hello World project, and under CSS, open your default.css file, and I'll just make this a little larger. And what we want to do is reuse this style and hit Control-C to copy, and switch back to your Hello World with Pages project, and select the home.css file. I'll zoom in and just double click that. Let's just zoom in here. And let's paste our greeting output style directly into the CSS. Let's go ahead and run and see what we've done so far. So there we see our UI, and we've recreated the UI from our last project. Next, we're going to add interactivity by copying our Hello World event handlers. Let's switch back to Visual Studio and click Stop. Step 3, copy your event handlers. In Solution Explorer, let's now select home.js to open up the JavaScript file. And I'll zoom in here. And you'll notice this page is much shorter, and that's because the default.js file already handles activation and core app logic. Each page control only needs to contain logic for the page itself. Now what you'll notice here is we're using the pages.define method in win.js.ui to define our home.html page control. And this method takes two parameters. The first is the URI to the actual page, home.html, and then any functions we want to declare in our home.js file. You might notice that the code doesn't include a call to win.js.ui.processAll. That's because the page control calls it for you automatically. And by the time the ready function executes, win.js.ui.processAll has already been called and has completed its processing. Let's switch in Visual Studio back to our Hello World project, and under JS in Solution Explorer, go ahead and just double click on default.js to open it. And I'll just increase the font size here and full screen this. And what we want to do is scroll to the bottom and take all of our event handlers that we added before, including our button click handler, our rating change, and our name input change event handlers. So I'm going to select these three functions. With those three, I'll click copy, and then go to your Hello World with Pages. And back in our home.js file, so under our ready function, let's hit Control-V to paste our code in, and we'll scroll up. And now remember, when we use the pages.define method, it includes the URL and all the members of this page. So what we need to do is define all of these functions as member types. So we're going to change the syntax of each of these, just like we did with ready, where we declared the name and then the function. We'll add a comma here, and then declare our next member. And our next member will be button click handler. So I'm going to cut the function keyword and say button click handler is the name, and then its type is of function. And I'm just going to select all of the code here. To make this a little easier to read, I'll just indent it. So now we've declared a member called button click handler that's a function. And we need to do the same thing with our other functions, so let's just do that. We need to add a comma separator between each member that we're declaring. And let's do the last one, which is this name input changed. So I'll just cut the name input changed, colon, and I'm declaring it as a function. And now let's select all the text and click Tab to make it really clear that all this code belongs to that function. Now we need to attach our event handlers. Let's scroll up, and what we're going to do this time is declare them all within this ready function. The ready function is called after the page control has automatically called win.js.ui.processAll for us. So what we're going to do is switch back to your Hello World project. What we're going to do is scroll up, and we're within our onActivated method, and inside there, we're inside the completed function that gets executed after processAll. Now let's select all of this code all the way up to and before restore app data, because we're going to do that in our next step. So just take everything up to restore app data and hit Control-C to copy, and switch back to your Hello World with Pages project and add this within your ready function. I'll just hit a line break. I'll hit Control V to paste. Now if we try and run our application just by F5 or run here, we should get an error. And if we look at this error, what it's telling us is rating change is undefined. And what's going on is it can't find that method, and what we need to do, let me just click break and stop, is go back to our add event listener and make sure that we are using the this syntax. And I'll just say this dot to make sure that we have the right reference to rating change, and we'll do this for all of our event handlers. This dot button click handler, and you should be able to see it. This dot name input changed. With that change, let's click F5 or run. Our page loads, and let's say somebody special. We'll click say hello. And now let's try the rating control. I'll set 3 as an item, and we see that our event handler popped up, and we have that div value of 3. The next thing we need to do is restore the app state when the user launches it. So let's click Alt-Tab back to Visual Studio and click Stop. And we'll start step 4, restoring the app state. Switching back to our Hello World project, you'll remember we had 2 types of app state to restore. We had the username and the rating, and both of those were saved in roaming settings. Now we restored this state regardless of how the app was shut down. For the personalized greeting, that if we scroll down back to our button click handler, we'll see that we're saving this to a session state property that we created called greeting output. And we only restore this state if the app was successfully terminated the last time it ran. So the first thing we're going to do is scroll back up to where we see Restore App Data. And go ahead and select Restore App Data and restore the username and the rating. And we're going to copy that to our clipboard using Control-C. And now let's switch back to the Hello World with Pages project. And as you can see up here, we're within the home.js file. And within the ready function at the very bottom, after the name input, we're going to copy and paste our code here. And now without making any other modifications, we're able to restore both the username and the greeting rating value. Now we only want to restore the personalized greeting if the app was successfully terminated the last time it ran. Unfortunately, our page control doesn't provide a built-in way for us to check the app's previous execution state. That info is provided on the onActivated event handler in our default.js file. And in Solution Explorer, under the JS folder, go ahead and double-click default.js. And I'm going to zoom in to 140% to make this a little easier to read. And within default.js, go to the Add Event Listener for Activated. What we're going to do is save the app's previous execution state in the session state object by building our own custom property so that our page control can access it. So what we'll do is just add a new line here, and I'll add a quick comment here that says we're going to save the previous execution state. So let's get a reference to our session state by saying win.js.application.session_state. And from here, we'll add a new property named previous execution state equals. And I'll just add a line break to make it a little easier to follow. And we're going to set this to args.detail.previous execution state. And I'll hit Control-C to copy this and just set that value. Great, now that we have the previous execution state, let's switch over to the home.js file. What we're going to do is at the very end here, we're going to add a new line break, and we're going to add some code to be able to read that session state value. We'll add our comment here and say, if the app was terminated last time it ran, what we want to do is restore the personalized greeting. Let's add an if to compare the session state information. So first, let's get the win.js.application.session_state. And if you remember, we called our value previous execution state. And now let's compare this to Windows. And I just added a line break to make this a little easier to read. Windows.application.activation.application execution state, and we're looking for the terminated state. Now let's add some code, and we're going to read the greeting output from session state, and we'll just put it into a variable called output value. And just like before, win.js.application.session_state, and this time we called it greeting output, and we're going to set the greeting output .innerText for this div equal to that output value. So let's review what we've done. In our default.js file, we saved the previous execution state to a session state variable. And what we're going to do is see if the application execution state has been terminated, and if it has, what we'll do is read the session state greeting output value and set it to the inner text of this div. Let's exit at full screen and click F5 to run this. And notice our roaming settings for our username and our rating reloaded our data. Let's click the Say Hello button, and there we see our greeting output. I'm going to switch back to Visual Studio and click Suspend and Shut Down. Suspend and shut down here. And let's run it again, and let's see if our session state loads. And there we see our Hello Somebody Special value. And at this point, we've duplicated the functionality we had in our original Hello World app. Let's switch back to Visual Studio and go ahead and click Stop to stop our application. And in our next step, we'll show how you can actually navigate between pages. Step 5, add another page. Let's switch to our Solution Explorer, and what we want to do is under Pages, we're going to add a new folder. So by convention, we should be adding a new folder for each of these different page controls. So with Pages selected, select Add, and select New Folder. And what we're going to do is name this Page 2. Now with Page 2 selected, right-click and select Add New Item. Select the page control, and let's replace the name at the bottom with page2.html. And with that, let's select Add. And switching back to Solution Explorer, you'll notice that within Page 2, we've added the CSS, HTML, and JavaScript file. Now that we've created a new page, in the next step, we're going to learn how to navigate to it. Step 6, use the Navigate function to move between pages. In Solution Explorer, expand the Home folder, and what we're going to do is just double-click the home.html file to open it. Now let's scroll down in our page to the very bottom, and here, I'll just add a comment here, and we'll say this is going to be a hyperlink to page2.html. And let's add just a new paragraph for our link. We'll say href equals, and we'll do a reference to pages, page2, page2.html. Let's call this go to page 2. So let's exit full screen and just run this, and let's see what happens. We do see our hyperlink. Let's go ahead and click it. However, there's a problem. The app actually performed a top-level navigation, meaning instead of replacing home.html with page 2, it actually replaced the default Chrome to page2.html. So let's switch back to Visual Studio, and we'll show how we can use the Page Control Navigator control to perform this type of navigation fairly easily. So the first thing we're going to do is switch to our home.js file. Just double-click here to make sure that it's open. And let's scroll to the very bottom. And let's add a new member here. And let's make sure to add a comma first. And we're going to call this link click event handler. And this will be a function that takes event info. The first thing we're going to do is in event info, we're going to call prevent default. This will prevent the default link behavior, which is navigating directly to the specified page. The next thing we want to do is actually get that link from the target. So we'll say event info.target. And from here, we're going to use the WinJS navigation navigate function. And I'll just show that, WinJS under navigation. And you'll see that we have a navigate function here. And we'll pass in our link and the href from our hyperlink. So just to recap, we built a little function that prevents the default link behavior. We get the hyperlink from the event info, and then we're going to navigate to the href for that hyperlink. So let's scroll all the way back up to our ready function again. And in our ready function, go ahead and just add a new line break, and what we're going to do is use the WinJS utility query to listen to hyperlink queries and add a click event handler that points to our link click event handler. we're going to be using win.js.utilities.query. We're going to be querying for the anchor tags here. And what we want to listen to is the click event for all of these anchor tags. And when there's a click event, what we'll do is fire our this.linkClick event handler. And we'll say false for use capture. And we'll take this to full screen so you can see it a little better. So what this will do for any hyperlinks that are clicked, we'll actually fire our linkClick event handler. The nice thing about this approach is that it'll work for any number of links on the page. And even though right now we only have one link, with this approach we could add more links and we wouldn't have to change any of our code. So let's go ahead and just click F5 or run our app here. We'll click our hyperlink, which will fire that linkClick event handler. We should see our welcome to page 2 and our ability to use the back button to now navigate between these two pages. In our next step, we're going to add an app bar for additional navigation. So let's go back to Visual Studio and click Stop, and we'll start Step 7. Add an app bar for additional navigation. Now our app contains several pages. The question is, where should we put our app bar? If our app bar contains commands that should be available to every page, you should be adding it to the default.html page, since that is the container page that would be navigating to all these different page controls. Now if your app bar is different from page to page, you can define a different app bar in each of your page control objects. And you can of course combine both techniques and define a central app bar in default.html and then modify it as you load different page control objects. So what we're going to do is create a simple app bar that lets the user navigate between home.html and page2.html. And we'll define that in our default.html page. So in Solution Explorer, find default.html and just double click the file to open it. We'll full screen the file and notice that we already have a div defined that's commented out for an app bar. Let's select the commented code, and I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut Control-K-U to uncomment that. And just with that done, let's go ahead and run and see our app bar. So to show our app bar, just right click and you'll see that we have our placeholder command that doesn't actually do anything. Let's go back to Visual Studio and let's format that app bar. Now let's customize the first app bar button, and I'm just going to hit a line break here, and we're going to set some different options. Now our first button is going to be our home button, so let's just call that home button. And let's set a couple different properties here. The label, that can just be home, and the icon. And there's several pre-built icons. I'm going to use the home icon, but you can of course use the pre-built ones or your own PNGs. And I'm going to delete type of button here. We're going to put this all within the data win options. So we'll add, let me just add a line break and we'll do a section. We want the section to be global. And we also want to set a tooltip property. And we'll set this to go to the home page. And finally, we'll redeclare that this is a button type. And for readability, I'll just put that on another line. And we'll just kill this line break. Now for simplicity, I'm going to copy paste this button directly under our home button. And let me just format this selection. Now this button is going to be used to navigate to the page 2 button. So we'll just say page 2 button. Let's set the label equal to page 2. We'll use the page icon. The global section is fine, and we'll say now go to page 2. And type of button is fine as well. Now that we have our 2 buttons, let's add a horizontal rule or HR tag. Just set HR. And now we need to set 2 things here. The data win control to an app bar command and the data win options that lets it know it's a type separator. So let's set the data win control. And what we'll do is set that to an app bar command. And the next thing we want to do is set that win options. So we'll do the same thing here, data win options. And from here we're going to set a couple different properties. Let's first set the type. And this is going to be a type of separator. And the section is going to be global. And let's make sure we just have an end tag here. Now one last thing we want to change with our app bar is to have our app bar placement be in the top Now by default, our app bar is going to be set to the bottom. But in the guidelines and checklists for app bars that are used for navigation should appear at the top. So what we're going to do is change the property for our app bar and set the placement to top. And what we're going to do here is, just like we did before, our data win options, we're going to set this equal to placement of top. Placement colon top. Now that we've declared our app bar, let's go ahead and style it, and I'll hit Shift-Alt-Enter, and in Solution Explorer, expand the CSS folder and double-click the default.css file to open it. And I'll increase our zoom to make it a little easier to read. And at the top of our default.css, we're going to add a style for our app bar. So we'll just say app bar, and let's just define the style. And what we'll do is set the background color. Now let's set the background color property. And what we're going to do is set a hexadecimal value here. You do see you get a color picker, that's kind of nice. But I want to set 03ABE2. And this will change the background color of our app bar div. Let's switch back to our default.js file. So to do that, in Solution Explorer, expand the JS folder and double-click default.js. And after the activated event handler, let's just collapse that. Go ahead and add some line breaks here, because we're going to be adding 2 functions to be able to handle those app bar button click events. Let's declare our first function. That's going to be our go to home page, and that's going to pass in an event info. And like we did before, we're just going to call the navigate method here, winjs.navigation.navigate. And from here, we're just going to pass in a path. And let's set that path as /pages home.html to go back to our home page. Now let's add another function called go to page 2. Just like before, we're going to receive an event info for the signature. And within here, what I can do is just copy paste our WinJS navigation code, and we'll simply change the path that we're going to. Instead of home, we're going to be going to page 2, and we'll call this page2.html. Now, at the very top of our page, just after the WinJS navigation, we're going to create a couple of variables for the navigation buttons. So let's add a quick comment, create variables for the navigation buttons. And let's call these var home button and page 2 button. And what we're going to do is go into our activated event handler and set those values. So let's expand the activated event handler, and we'll full screen this. And what we're going to do is scroll down to our promise after process all, and we're going to add a little bit of code here that sets the app bar values. And first, let's retrieve the app bar. So let's just add a comment, retrieve the app bar. And we'll get this into an app bar variable. And what we're going to do is use what we typically do, get element by ID, to get the div for the app bar. But inside the div, what we want is the win control. Now what we're going to do is attach event handlers. Attach event handlers to the command buttons. So first, let's get a reference to the home button. We declared a home button variable already, and we'll say this is an app bar dot get command by ID. Command by ID. And if you remember, we called this command home button. And for our home button, we'll add an event listener. And this event listener is going to be our click event. And we're going to tell it to execute the go to home page function. We'll just pass in false. Now we're going to be doing the same thing for the page 2 button. So we'll just copy and paste here. And we'll call this page 2 button instead. And the ID we're going to be getting is the page 2 button ID. Let's make sure to update this page 2 button as well. And for the click event for the page 2 button, what we want to do is go to the go to page 2 function that we wrote earlier. Let's just quickly review what we've done. Within our process all, after it runs, what we're going to do is get a reference to our app bar control and make sure to get the win control. And then what we're going to do is use the get command by ID to get reference to those home buttons and add a click event listener that calls our functions that we wrote earlier. Now that we've wired up our event handlers, let's go ahead and click F5 and run our app. If we right-click, you'll notice obviously a couple things. Our app bar is blue based on the CSS style we defined. We have a horizontal rule, and we have 2 buttons. Let's click page 2, and you'll notice our page automatically goes to page 2, and click our home page, and we're able to go back to our home page. Now we're almost done. The one thing you may notice is while we're on the home page, we can still click the home page to navigate back to the home page. Let's add some code to disable the navigation buttons when they don't do anything useful. One easy way to update the button is to use the navigated event. Let's switch back to Visual Studio and click Stop. Now in our default.js file, in the JS folder, go ahead and double click that to make sure that we're editing within the right file. And I'll just full screen this, and what we're going to do is add a navigate handler function. And let's collapse the add event listener by clicking here. And after I go to page 2, we're going to add one more function called navigated handler. So let's add that. And our navigated handler takes an event info. And what we're going to do within here is use a couple of if statements to read the event info detail location to see if we're on the home page. And if we're on the home page, disable the button. Similarly, if we're on the page 2 page, disable that button. So let's add that first. We'll add if event info dot detail dot location equals, and now we're going to point to our pages, home.html for our first test. And if that's true, remember we have our home button that we declared at the very top. We'll say home button.disabled equals true. Similarly, we should make sure that page 2 disabled equals false. And the reason we want to do that is because we're going to be toggling the disabled values between true and false for both. Now we're going to be doing the exact same thing here, so I'm going to copy here and say else and paste. This time what we want to do is make sure that we are within the page 2 file, so I'm just going to copy that path to make sure to get it right. So if our location is within page 2, we're going to swap these. We're going to set this equal to false and this one equal to true. So just to recap here, our navigated handler, depending on the location, we're going to be disabling buttons or enabling buttons. Now we need to wire this up using add event listener. And to do that, what we're going to do is go into the activated add event listener and expand this and find the process all. So we have the promise that we know this code is going to run. And this is where we're going to add the method to be able to call our function. And what we're going to do is just between the page 2 and the nav.location, we're going to call an add event listener on navigation. So we'll say win.js.navigation.add event listener. And we'll call this navigated. So that's the event that we want to listen to. And this is where we're going to call our navigated event handler, called navigated handler. And we'll just say false here. Now that we've wired the event handler, let's go ahead and click F5 and run here. And what you'll notice is when I click the app bar, it's grayed out depending on the page. So if I'm on the home page, this is grayed out. I click page 2, and notice the page 2 app bar is grayed out. I can't click on it. The home page is active, and you'll see that we're toggling which page that we can actually navigate to. Congratulations, you've completed part 3, Page Control Objects and Navigation. We learned how to use the navigation app template in Page Control Objects, and how to add an app bar to navigate between pages using the Win.js navigation service.